Um, Awesome. So yes, today we're talking about gesture. Um, and because I feel that a lot of people who might be working on these sketches might be less familiar with working with gesture. I've got a little bit of kind of general information on gesture before we get into the how to do it for the sketch. Um, so Firstly, quite clearly that language is not unimodal. It's there's the spoken speech sign stream, but then also gestures. Um, so much else is going into communicating when languaging than just speaking or signing. And gesture is really important in all communication, but especially with young children. And so it really helps young children to communicate as they're learning more language, more words, more syntax, and it helps caregivers communicate with children. It's quite tends to be used more with younger children. There's elements of gesture by and with children which appear to be universal. And there's also elements which are culturally specific. And so it's an area which is really interesting to look at in these sketch descriptions to try and evaluate these universal claims in the limited extent that the sketch can, um, and um, and to gather more rich, varied data in this the variation that's present across languages and cultures. But gesture is very time consuming to analyze. And so we don't actually suggest that people do in depth gesture analyses in their sketch descriptions. Um, so I'll talk through kind of, well, what do we suggest and how do you decide what to do and when to do and how much to do and so on. So, firstly, there are four main types of gesture that are described, and it's good to have an idea of what these are before we continue. So, there's the deictic points. These are essentially points, and they are kind of prototypically finger points, but they could also be lip points or head points. There's all sorts of these kind of deictic gestures that are indicating a referent, which can be something which is physically present or something which is in the kind of figurative communication context. So where you might set out things like, oh, okay, there's these four types of gesture, and now we're going to be talking about this one. So you set things up in that space and talk about them. And it's these deictic pointing gestures which are believed to be universal, though there's more recent discussion about variation in the form of these points across cultures. And questions around kind of whether everyone does index points, or maybe there might be other forms of points, particularly kind of middle finger points or whole hand points as a basic point. There's these kind of conventional emblematic gestures. So these are the types of gestures which are kind of more word-like, where there's a more conventionalized meaning associated with that form. So thumbs up could be like yes, or agreement or good. It's got a kind of a more word-like meaning associated with it. And these are gestures that you might then be able to list in word lists or in kind of materials for um, uh, lots of different kind of community materials. So early child word lists, we've been listing these, so Carmel in the early, and sorry, I'm blanking on, it was the early, and then
Little
Carmel's
kids
made
word
it
list.
the
Oh,
little
sorry.
kids learning words,
Little kids word list.
the little kids word list.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um, and so there's a range of these conventional gestures which are listed in that word list as words that kids know and can use. And they often feature quite strongly in caregiver child interactions. So routines around, waving goodbye and these sorts of things. It's good to have a grasp of these for these kind of community materials. And these are the ones which vary greatly across cultures. So they're very culturally specific. So there's the classic kind of head nod versus shake in UK English versus in India, and yes versus no there. Thirdly, there's these representational or iconic gestures, and these are gestures which are depicting an object, event, or attribute. So it could be, okay, it's small, it's this big, these kinds of iconic depiction gestures. And children tend to start producing these at around 2 years of age. So the sketch data is likely to kind of capture these early representational gesture time period, but they tend to be quite rare. And so they're not very likely to feature in the sketch data. If you're particularly interested in gesture analysis or you happen to notice some of them, you might want to tag them and mark them, but we don't have any kind of specific questions targeted to them in the core gesture questions. And finally, there's beat gestures. So these are the kind of prosodic, rhythmic gestures that people often make when they're talking. I've been making them pretty well constantly through this talk. And these are actually kind of the most frequent type of gesture, but they're less studied. And partly because they're so frequent, we don't suggest analyzing them for the sketch. There's going to be a lot of work to do that, and it's going to take, it's going to be a big project to analyze beat gestures in like this for relatively less gain. So,
Rebecca,
yeah.
I don't know if you can see, but the slides aren't transitioning.
Oh,
We're still on the title slide. I'm not sure if you've got.
thank you for letting me know.
No, it's fine.
I
Because
was, yeah, I
I,
thought I was awesome.
yeah, no, you were awesome. Don't worry. But
Oh, I was trying to be fancy. There you
yeah,
go.
yeah.
So there's these four types of gesture and so I was using presenter view and thinking it was all linking up, but it wasn't. Okay. So, um, That's okay. Now we're to the point where it's particularly useful to have the slides. So some theories or some highlights from gesture theory research. So as I said before, child language acquisition of speech and sign is really closely linked with gesture. And gesture typically appears first before speech or sign, and there tends to be an early reliance on gesture in communication, and
¿Este
this
está libre?
decreases as children develop more lexicon and syntax. So these didactic gestures are typically the first to appear, and they emerge in the first year of life, and they typically express a range of functions and kind of almost act like verbs, with the gesture acting as the verb and the referent of the gesture being the argument of those verbs. So they can do things like giving, in holding objects out to people, showing as well, holding objects out, requesting, so holding hands out for objects, and attention directing points. And Bob Kelly's done some great research on this in English, showing different forms of deictic gestures and with their reference being used in this way. And this kind of deictic attention directing gesture is often referred to as a declarative point. It's pointing to direct attention, and it typically is at around 12 months of age. And it's really significant for the cognitive development in all this elements of theory of mind and being able to direct another's attention to something. And it also plays a very high functional load in child-directed language, in exactly this establishing and negotiating joint attention. And it's these declarative points that are believed to be universal in both child language and child-directed language, but the form can vary. And the sketch isn't going to capture the emergence of these, but it would be good to note their presence and absence, or absence if you don't notice any, and the form of these types of points. And looking at conventional gestures in particular, so some languages are more gesture rich than others, and this is particularly seen in the range and frequency of conventional gestures. And so tracking the frequency and type count of conventional gestures in the sketch would be a way to get a window onto this variation. And in some cases, this is potentially more extreme or more interesting for other reasons, when there's a sign language that's also present in the community. So this could be, cases of bilingualism between sign and spoken languages, or cases where there's an alternate sign language that's used in the community, like in Central Australia. And in these cases, describing the conventional gestures is really necessary because you've got this this other language in use by these children, by these caregivers, which is in the manual mode. modality. And so you want to be tracking how much of that they're using, and there isn't any research yet on acquisition of these alternate sign languages, or how they get incorporated into early childhood experiences for children. So it'd be really valuable. And so I'm working on that a little bit with the Pitandera sketch, but because it involves a more in-depth analysis of the gesture, it's quite time consuming and I haven't quite finished it yet. Okay. So we've got these two boxes in the sketch of recommendations for the questions to look at for gestures in child language and in child-directed language. And they're essentially actually the same questions. It's just whether it's related to the children or the caregivers. So I've merged them here to box 7/12. And there's two core questions. So what types of deictic gestures do children/caregivers use? Which is looking at these, tapping into all this work on deictic gestures, plus linguistically and potential universality, and their role in negotiating joint attention. And two, what conventionalized gestures do children/caregivers use? Which is linking into, it could link into your sections on the lexicon, but it's looking at the range and frequency of these conventionalized gestures. And then if you want to get into the extensions, it's looking at these representational or iconic gestures and whether or not they're used, and if so, how. And for each type of gesture, how those gestures are supporting the communicative development. And my little thing is in the way here. How those gestures change across the development of the child. So gesture analysis can be really time consuming, and so we're not generally encouraging you to code and analyze all of the gestures in the sketch data. But when do we suggest that you do that? So I suggest coding if you're not noticing any deictic gestures. So if as you go through, you're not noticing any points, then that would be a really good reason to go through and code it, because that's really unusual. And you'd want to know whether it's just that you didn't notice any or there actually aren't any in the sketch data. Code it if there's an alternate sign language, like in Pitandera, or if you're particularly interested and have the resources to do that. You may also want to code all the gestures if there aren't very many in the sketch data, just because then it lowers the cost of doing so. Okay. If you're coding, I suggest you start with one gesture tier. If you look at kind of how to analyze gestures, you can go all out with multiple tiers and looking at how it aligns exactly with the non-gestural components, and what body parts being used, and all these different elements you can go into. But for this analysis, I suggest you just use one gesture tier, and you're noting the type and the function of each gesture. So this could be that it's a point, and that it's an imperative point, so it's telling someone to do something, or it's a declarative point, You can mark the body part that's used for that point if you want. I've used emblem here, but it's a conventional gesture. Emblem is just a shorter word to list in the coding, and what that is, so that it's a thumbs up, and it's being used for agreement, these sorts of things. Then from this coding, you'd be able to create a taxonomy of the gestures in the sketch data. Now, in the more likely case that you're not coding all of the gestures, what do you do? So there the approach is to, as you're going through analyzing the data, transcribing it, you keep an eye out for gestures and tag a few examples as you go. And you can use the same format of the type function if you want, or you can just code, gesture and as a little tag, and then come back later and go and pull them out. And then to attempt to answer the questions from the boxes, from these tagged examples and your impressions going through the data. So just these kind of two core questions on the deictic gestures and the conventionalized gestures and how they're being used. And there's two examples I wanted to talk through of how that's done. And the first is the Inuktitut. So this is a great example of a complete sketch. I encourage you to have a look at Hannah and Shanley's sketch there for all the great detail and the wonderful pictures. But just to give you a very quick impression, they actually did code and count all of the gestures, but there weren't very many. So you can see here in the 1 hour of adult speech for most of the age points, they had 5 to 1 gesture in that time. And this was partly because the adults were largely out of video frame, but it meant that there really weren't many gestures to code. Still, they could see that the deictics were being used to direct the child's attention, and it was typically with the index finger, but there were other forms. And notably, gestures became much less frequent with children after this first time point. Similarly, in the child gestures, they weren't very frequent. And so they were able to code them all. And at every age, children were using deictic gestures to influence attention. And there was this real decrease after the first 2 time points. And a variety of hand shapes were used, so whole hand and index points, as well as holding objects up. So this is kind of one way you can do it, coding all of the gestures, and you can have more of a look at Hannah and Shanley's sketch to see all the details. Lucy kindly gave me her in-progress Pata gesture data, and here the analysis is impressionistic with tagged examples being drawn on. So this is the kind of more likely approach to the gesture coding in the sketch. And we're able to see that the deictic gestures are being used to influence attention, and there's a lot of index finger pointing, but also other forms, and a conventionalized gesture for come here. Okay. So some examples. So here we have a 2-year, 6-month-old who points to her older sister, locating her for her mother. So she points by raising her arm, extending her whole forearm, and an index finger with the other fingers only slightly retracted. And this is quite common in Murrumbidgee. Bob Kelly had also commented on it, and it's less typical. There tends to be more kind of full retraction in the prototypical index finger point cross-linguistically. So there's that lovely example. You can see that point really clearly there. Adults point as well, both to each other and to the children, and they're pointing to locate nearby places and the events in stories that they tell and in various other interactions. So as an example here of two adults sitting with children telling a story and pointing to locate various places in that story. They're using the same form as the child's point. They also use a lip point and a head tilt. So just play that example. You can see head tilts. Index finger. And there's many deictic gestures in this just, a few seconds of footage. So there's also this conventionalized come here gesture. So here it's a 3-year-old child to an older brother. And it's this 3-year-old child, and it's done with a full arm rotation from behind the shoulder. And it's really quite a large, beautiful gesture. Play it once more. It's just beautiful. And this contrasts with the adult conventionalized come here gestures. So this is an adult doing it to their niece. The hands extended towards the child's chest, palms down, and it's just a retraction of some of the fingers quickly towards the palm. Smaller gesture. Yeah, so it's just this much smaller gesture. And again, this kind of repeated hand movement to the side, much closer to the body than the child example. And there's one noted representational or iconic gesture, so it's great to see how see an example of this. So here she's gesturing to drink, and it's this iconic gesture there. So both the Inuktitut and the Murunpata descriptions are able to describe the types of deictic gestures that children and caregivers use, either coding them all or just picking out some examples. And to list the conventionalized gestures that children and caregivers are using in the sketch. And they've both kind of done little bits of these extensions looking at the change across development and any kind of examples of representational gestures that are found in the sketch. So that's the idea of how one might go about studying gesture in these sketches, and also kind of placing it within some of the theoretical context and why you might want to be doing that, and why we're suggesting you particularly look at these deictic gestures and also this range of conventionalized gestures. And questions, discussions.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so open it up to question or comments or discussion now, if anyone's got something.
I was going to ask a quick question. So in previous presentations and things you've talked about talking with the caregivers to kind of like get their feedback about what
Yeah,
they tend to do with kids and what kids are doing. And I'm wondering if you find that that's useful in this kind of gesture domain too, or if they're saying anything.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, so caregivers are often, um, so I guess generally people um, are quite aware of conventionalized gestures and are able to give lots of examples for that and kind of go, oh yes, I know what you're talking about. It's thumbs up, it's waving, it's nodding, it's they can give all those sorts of examples and talk about situations where they use them. Um, and so talking with caregivers about conventionalized gestures with children can be really informative to kind of fill those out. Um, and you might want to do that particularly if you're trying to develop more community materials and looking at words, whether they're spoken or conventional gestures that are used by and with young children. And so Carmel and the little kids learning words um, has worked with families and people looking at these conventional gestures and including those in the word list, and they were kind of through that community discussion. So there, absolutely. Um, sometimes some people are quite um, conscious of other gestures that they're doing, but sometimes those tend to be um, less conscious, less people are less aware of them, and so um, it might be less valuable to discuss that. You could absolutely, um, but I expect it would be much more readily available in the conventionalized gestures. Yeah.
Um, Harpe, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, had a question.
Yeah, I'm Celeste Escobar. I'm connected from New York. And Delfina, Roberta, I just wanted to ask you, how would you recommend um, transcription or in your tire of gesture when you also combine hand movement with narrative, like the gazing? I
Yeah.
have a lot of gazing, especially in narrative in my context.
Mm. Thanks for that. I was wondering how much I should talk about that. So, um, eye gaze is really important and can be used very similarly to these deictic points. Um, and um, it can also be it can be harder to code just because it's less visible generally. So, but if you're wanting to do it, if you're finding it really important, if it's something that you're interested in, then by all means do it. There would be two ways I would suggest doing it. One would be to kind of just conflate it with the other kind of deictic gestures and um, be saying, okay, these are all deictics. These ones are index finger points, and these ones are eye gaze, and just saying grouping them as types by the kind of the body part used to articulate those. Or you might want to separate them more, particularly because they are less easily codable You might think that there's something quite different going on there, and there you might want to say, okay, let's just do 2 tiers for the gesture analysis, one for manual gestures, or non-eye gestures, and you could group head nods and things like that in there as well, and do an eye gaze tier separate.
Interesting that you suggest all these different tires, because that has been the challenge, thinking about whether separated it, because I realize that the eye gazing communication and some of the hand gestures sometimes go together, especially when they are using serial verbs.
Yeah.
And in that moment, for me, it's difficult to try to separate, because it's like a compound thing altogether. The language with it seems like sometimes the gesture of the hands is like mimicking one of the verbs, and the eyes like directing you towards like the narration. But then other times the gazing is just by itself, is silent. It doesn't necessarily go with the hand.
Yeah.
So it's hard to classify, definitely.
It's really hard to classify.
Yeah. Whether you're just gonna dedicate a work saying, okay, I'm just gonna talk about all these layers of eye gazing communication, and there is eye gazing with serial verbs, there is eye gazing with hands movement and mimicking, and there is eye gazing by itself. Probably I will end up doing something like that, because that I've been battling with how I will transcribe all of those levels.
And this is, in a way, a perfect example for the analyzing gesture is really time consuming and really complex point.
Totally.
So once you get into these details, and if you're wanting to analyze it at that level, it's really complex. It takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of different kind of variables to consider. So absolutely, once you get to that, you have to kind of separate out the different articulators and look at, okay, what's happening with eye gaze, what's happening with the hands, what's happening with each hand, what's happening with the head, what's happening with and you're just exactly going over the video again and again and again and again and again, and an hour on 1 minute of video.
I just jump in there and say, in the context of the sketch, it's really what we've tried to do is build in some sort of agency for everyone. It's in the sense that if you were describing gestures, you could do it in a kind of minimal format, like the way that Rebecca has said. But of course, what Tape is describing is like a huge richness of the interaction that's not just verbal, but it's multimodal. And what you alluded to, Rebecca, is that even if it's not, you can go beyond eye gaze even, right? So you can do things like people are looking at facial expressions and eyebrow raises and all that kind of stuff, which seems to be related to, for instance, interrogatives in some data and some languages, but probably a lot. So I think one thing to remember here is the sky's the limit if you want to deep dive into it, but it's not necessary for the sketch. And maybe it's good to do the sketch in a more minimal format and then dig deeper into some of those really rich kind of things that are coming out of it later on for other types of publications.
Exactly.
Carmel, you were next.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I was just thinking, in my data, for example, there are some things that might not occur in those 5 hours of video, but they occur in the corpus.
Yeah.
And so some of those might be quite important to include sort of as a complete sense of what children are doing, just because the children in that particular recording mightn't have done it for whatever reason, but it happens, in other recordings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same sort of thing as Evan was just saying, but in a different, from a different angle, that there's the 5-hour kind of minimal sketch, but again, the sky's the limit as to how much other material you want to or are able to include or refer to in your analysis.
Yeah.
If I could jump in
Away.
a moment. I think that one of the things we found very useful in transcribing gesture and gaze was to have separate transcribers, one who only did gestures and put in all the timing for those gestures, and then one person who only did gaze and put in all the timing. And then we knew that we didn't have problems of, mixing up gaze and gesture as they were going on in the transcription. Yeah. And so having those in separate layers, and then we could do much more detailed analysis of the timing of each of these things when we looked at the data in detail.
Absolutely. And I would absolutely recommend doing that if you're doing the full or more detailed coding of gesture in the sketch. If you're taking the kind of recommended baseline approach for the sketch of just noting a few examples as you're going through, then I think you can do it while you're doing the other elements of analysis and just go, oh yes, that was a point. Good, we have points.
And so, Eve, when you say the timing, you mean the relative timing of the looks to the gesture?
We actually looked at the when the gesture began, so the onset of the gesture, and when it stopped. And we noted the time, so we had a millisecond count, and we were using Elan to do the transcription in. So we had these different tiers, and what we did was keep a separate tier for gaze, for gesture, and then we had separate tiers for whether it was a child, whether it was the adult.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Cecilia, you were next.
And me. Thank you. Great talk, Rebecca. I started to work on gesture this year, not this year, at the end of the past year, and I'm learning a lot from the gesture readings and looking at videos and now to your talk. That's the reason I just appeared now.
Wonderful.
And I've been working on two brands, on two sites. One is what kind of gestures go with the requests, how requests are. I'm doing language and gesture relation more than gesture alone or language. How gesture goes with requests, and from the other side, how points. I'm looking at points because they are pretty basic and you cannot just go across the videos and forget about them. And when I have questions about, well, for this occasion, I have a question for the pointings, because I've not so much, although it's also hard to see this is a point or this is an action or the gains of an action and starting to be a point or something. But I have the feeling that from the function side, the pointing makes a lot of stuff. Not just doing pointing, not just calling for attention, also doing requests or doing direct statements. And I found some modifications in the hand that seems to be sort of classifiers. I mean, for instance, they are pointing to a tree, to the oranges or the pomegranates in the tree, with hands open and moving for the tree. So kind of showing plurality or space of the object, or they make circles with the pointing, or making not particular reference to objects as such, but with the points pointing towards the direction they want to be taken. I mean, so they are pointing the compass of the hand shows direction. The pointing with hand open or with the with fingers moving or still, I think that's more than pointing. I'm thinking of presenting in December in an encounter of our group in Mexico, something that could be taught more than pointing, because I see lots of things at between 4 months and 2 years. I mean, in that range of age. So I don't know if people, because when I see the papers, they are very clean cut and nothing of this appears. And I read a paper by Senki, I don't know, Senki, something, I haven't heard the name in my life, so I don't know how to pronounce, urging the community to take care very carefully of the form of the gesture. I agree, because I agree with that kind of appeal to the community, because I think there's a lot of information there. They are polyedric, or I mean, they have volume and movement. So I think that this for the sketch may not be interesting, except for the classifier part of section, because it can be related to a language with classifiers. I mean, thinking typology.
Absolutely, and that's
so it's
awesome.
it is, but I think kind of crazy, because I'm just a parvenu in this field, and then I see things I haven't from the experts. I haven't read from the experts. It's just what to do with that type of observations. Eve, do you know more than everyone here? I think.
Definitely not crazy. And exactly, there's so much richness in the gesture, and in the form of these deictic gestures, which can be used to indicate different functions, but also different other elements. So there's a recent paper in Central Australia where they're seeing that the form of the gesture is indicating the number of the referent. So the language has a single, dual, like 3 and plural distinction. And it's the same in the gesture. So if you're pointing to one thing, then it's a one finger point. If there's 2 people or 2 things, it's a 2-person, 2 finger point, 3 and many with the whole hand point. And so the form of
Could you please put the reference in the some cue to look at the paper?
Yeah. If I can find it in the next few minutes, then I will, and if not, I will email it to you. Yeah. The form of the gesture is agreeing with the language's number system and is agreeing with the number of the referent. And it sounds quite similar to these, the idea of a classifier form in the point, and how that might play out in a language with a classifier system, which is then also seeing the same in the form of the gesture. That would be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think actually, when someone comes to an established field with fresh eyes, they see things that other people don't look for. So I also agree, you're not crazy. And also your kids are pretty young, and it sounds like it might be consistent with some of the arguments that people like Virginia Volterra and the Italians have argued for some time, is that there's sort of like early sensory motor representations that are coming out in the language, so that the early language itself is difficult to separate from these sensory motor representations. And that, I guess it would be consistent with that. They've done a lot of detailed descriptions, even longitudinal stuff on their kids, because Italian and Italy is a gesture-rich culture. But I don't remember them describing stuff like that. And I guess maybe that could be because you're really taught that there's this sort of taxonomy of gesture types, like we've presented, that maybe maybe there's just a lot more going on under the within those categories, and especially what sounds like grammatical information. Yeah, Eve, do you have any comment on that?
I was thinking of David Wilkinson's work actually, because my memory is that he did quite a lot on different forms of Deixis that children were using, but I don't remember the details. It might be worth looking up those papers. And that was on what a language near Alice Springs, as I remember.
Yeah, that
Aranda.
was on
Mm.
Aranda. And
Yes,
it's
that's
like
right. Yeah.
whole hand points and height of the arm for different distances, close
Yes.
or far away, and whole hand versus index or middle finger.
Right.
thing.
And you get, height of different gestures also in Inuit communities. So up in Greenland and northern Canada. So I think there may be some interesting things that one could track down on that.
Well, so I will continue to see and play with my videos and get lost.
Sounds fascinating. So please do continue.
I will.
Any other questions or comments? Well, if there aren't any, we'll thank Rebecca for her great presentation. And did we want to have a quick conversation, actually, Rebecca, about, like we said at the beginning, some of you have come in at different times, but we're sort of ending this phase of the sketch because we've gone through all of the sections of it, and the next one is going to be on community reports. And we're sort of a little bit unsure about how to continue doing these sessions. And I guess there's sort of a few options. One is if people are furiously working away at their sketch, it can just be sort of like a drop-in type situation where people can come and talk about various things. One of the other options, Rebecca, I can't remember. There's been a few emails going.
Yeah, I was just going to check.
I can't remember either.
Okay. So Shanley had these questions, which is like, what do you want to do next to help your own sketch? And what would be best to build your sketch community? And yeah, then a bunch of other questions which are less relevant. So I don't think we had any kind of other particularly clear ideas.
Anyway, so thoughts, comments are welcome. If not now, or just email us. But yeah, we'd sort of, I think, we've come to this. It's been 2 years worth actually, but feels like it's gone very quick. But we want to get now we've hopefully built momentum. We want to really help people to do their sketches so we can get lots more out there.
What if people who are currently working on sketches might be willing to do like in progress presentations? Because it'd be kind of nice to get someone who's thinking about eventually doing a sketch, a kind of like behind the scenes look of like, what are you working on? How's it going kind of for you right now? Like kind of see, I don't know, kind of see one in progress if folks are willing.
Yeah, that's a nice idea, and give some kind of more formalized structure to the drop-in for people working on sketches. So someone would actually have responsibility to be presenting where they were up to that particular session.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We'll feed that back to Shanley and Becca. Could be a goer. Okay. All right. Well, we can finish there. Thanks so much for coming. It's been a big group. It's just obviously an interesting topic, and we'll see you next month, and then hopefully also thereafter. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
The time zone you're in.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.